Good afternoon. I'll just allow a few minutes while people are joining the call and we'll kick off shortly. Okay, we've got quite a few people here, so I might just kick off now and welcome you to this webinar today. Thank you so much for joining us. The webinar that CSC is putting on today with AIA is on mood and food. I'm Simone Fox. I'm the Head of Shared Value at AIA Australia. Just to let you know that the session is being recorded today. Marika, if you could just jump to that next slide, please. Thank you. We'll just do an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of the country throughout Australia, because we are virtual today, and their continuing connection to land, waters and community. We pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. So you're probably wondering who AIA is. If you wouldn't mind jumping to the next slide, Marika, please. AIA is CSC's insurer for products available in PSAT, ADF Super and PSS. We support people to embrace their health and wellbeing, and we support members when they're well, unwell and recovering. So today we're going to be talking about mood and food. I think when we think about our mental health, we tend to think about things like maybe stress management or mindfulness, but it's really important to think of our mental health as holistically. So you may be aware that exercise plays an important role in our health and wellbeing overall, and also in our mental health. But did you know that what you eat can actually impact your mood? So today we're going to hear from Marika Day, who's an accredited practicing dietitian and nutritionist with over 10 years of experience in a variety of clinical and non-clinical areas. Her expertise and interests include gastrointestinal nutrition, which is influenced by her personal experience with coeliac disease. Additionally, she focuses on women's health and the complexities of disordered and emotional eating. In addition to her clinical expertise, Marika regularly works in recipe development, helping people make nutritious choices every day. Her approach to nutrition is balanced, practical and empathetic, and aims to help people enjoy food and life in a healthy, balanced way. So it's an interesting time of year to be talking about nutrition as we head into the Christmas season and are faced with all sorts of yummy foods, but this will empower you to make really great decisions over that festive season and to look after your mental health at the same time. At the end of the session today, we will be taking Q&A, so you can pop your questions into the chat function, please. So we can't actually access the Q&A as external presenters, so if you could just pop into the chat function, that would be fantastic. I'd like to hand over now to Mark Ryan from CSC. Mark is the Head of Enablement and Core Communication. So over to you, Mark.
Thanks, Simone. Welcome, everybody. Thank you very much for taking the time to be with us today. CSC and AIA have a long-standing relationship, and we thought, let's make sure that we're sending relevant messages to our customers at this time of year. So we're delighted to have Marika along. We plan on doing a number of these sessions throughout 2025. So if you are, really looking for more content to think about your well-being and your connection back to us at CSC and AIA, please feel free to give us some feedback on how that felt today and also some of the topics that are of great interest to you. I'm particularly excited about this. I think at this time of year, we do have that tendency where we go, oh, I'm a little bit invincible and I'll let myself go a little bit. So it's important to treat oneself, but also just think about your overall well-being. So I think this is a great topic. We really appreciate everybody taking the time to be on the line, and we're excited to hear from Marika. So on behalf of CSC, thank you, AIA and Marika, and we'll let you take it away.
Thank you so much, Mark and Sim, and welcome everybody and thank you for coming today. I'm super excited to talk to you about mood and food and how our eating and the way we eat and the things that we eat influence our mood and our mental health and essentially just our brain overall, because there's various ways that the way that we eat has an influence on our mental functioning, both in the short term and the long term, as we will see. And as we've mentioned, it is an interesting time of year to be talking about health and nutrition, because I do find towards the end of the year people are starting to sort of relax off with their eating, and we have a lot more treats and those sorts of things around the house or around at the workplace that we potentially normally wouldn't have. And as you would have heard in my bio, I'm someone who is very pro balance. Like, there's no point eating healthy at the detriment of living a balanced and healthy and enjoyable life. So I think it is important to enjoy those treats and those sorts of things and enjoy the festivities of this time of the year, but doing so mindfully, so that is essentially in alignment with your values, which is something that we're going to be talking about during this webinar. But yes, it'll be a nice little topic that hopefully you can all take away something from. And as I said, we've got the Q&A in the chat box at the end. So hopefully we'll get some great questions in there, and feel free to put in any questions related to the topic in there. So when we talk about food and mood and our brain and the foods that we eat, there's sort of two ways that this sort of relationship works. It's quite bi-directional. So the first way is that our emotions or our energy levels, so what's happening in our brain, is influencing the food choices that we make. Now, the way I get people to think about this is thinking about if you are stressed, tired, angry, overwhelmed, how does that influence your food choices? I'd say 9 out of 10 people, we would see some kind of influence on the foods that we are choosing, because we are potentially tired, we're going for a more convenient option. Because we are stressed, we're looking for something that's going to give us a perk up of energy, or going to light up the reward center in our brain is the other thing. And we do know that sugar does light up the reward center in our brain. So these are quite normal things to be craving and going for when you have a low mood. Now, the other way that our food influences our mood and our brain, and our food sort of communicate and connect, is through the food choices that we make and how they influence our mental well-being, our cognition, and our energy levels. So I think it's important to sort of recognize that there's these two components to food and mood, and two components to our mental well-being, and how food interplays with that. Another thing I want to acknowledge here is, with severe mental illness, food choices become a really, really challenging thing to manage, because when we've got severe depression and those sorts of things, what we find is that it's really, really challenging to actually prepare healthy and balanced meals. And again, that's something that we need to acknowledge when we are talking about food and mood, is that there is this more practical and more emotional side to it, where our brain is actually influencing our ability to make healthy choices. And I think it would be ignorant of me not to acknowledge that. We're not going to be speaking so much on that level today. We're going to be speaking more about how we can actually alter our cognition and mental well-being with the foods that we do choose. But as I said, I just want to acknowledge that first one there, to say that, when we are feeling tired, stressed, and whatnot, it actually does also impact the foods that we are choosing. Okay, so how is our diet impacting our mood? There's sort of three primary ways that I like to cover off here. Firstly is through our energy. So the foods that we eat will have an immediate impact on our energy levels, and sort of an impact over the course of the day. So what we find, obviously, is that if we are eating healthy and nutritious foods, we have improved energy levels. We also have steady energy levels. So we're not having that sort of 3 p.m. crash, or those crashes throughout the day, which is usually caused by unstable blood sugars. So depending on the types of carbohydrates that we're having, we tend to see these blood sugar spikes and these blood sugar crashes, which can influence our mood and our energy levels. The other thing with our energy levels is that they do influence our concentration. So when we are not essentially giving ourselves enough energy, it makes it really difficult to concentrate throughout the day, which obviously will then impact your cognition and your mood. The next way that food influences our mood is through our mental health and mental well-being. So there is a lot of new research in this area, and I'm going to go through some of it in this topic, but essentially what we do see is that there is some improved mood that we see with a diet with a healthy, balanced diet, and we'll talk about which sort of diet that is. But primarily what we see when it comes to nutrition and mood and how we eat and how it influences our mental health, it's through a reduced risk of depression or anxiety as well. So the things I want to pull out here is that we can control our risk of getting depression and anxiety more so than we can reduce the symptoms of depression and anxiety with our food. We can have a slight impact there, but most of the research in this area is showing that the way that we eat can influence our risk of developing depression and anxiety. And finally there we've got improved concentration, improved working memory, and reduced risk of age-related cognitive decline. So things like Alzheimer's and dementia as well. And whilst those are sort of longer-term future-thinking problems, I think they're really important to address now because they are things that, regardless of what your age is, the way that you're eating now is having an impact on how your brain is going to function in 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years' time. So there's, again, 4 ways that I sort of split this up. So those 3 things go into sort of 4 categories here, is how our diet impacts our short-term mood. So what is immediately happening when we eat? How is that food changing how we feel in the next hour or hours? Then we've got our longer-term mental health. So that's how it's having that effect on our mood and our mental health over a sustained period. And that's reducing that risk of depression and anxiety and potentially improving some of those depressive symptoms. And then we have the cognition and concentration. Now that's a longer term one as well. And that is talking about our brain health and our brain function as opposed to our mental health. But I wanted to include that in this. And finally, we've got our psychological state here, which is that other component that I mentioned before, which is how our mood influences our dietary choices. Okay, so when we're looking at the immediate impact of how our food impacts our mood, the 4 key things we are looking at is hydration, carbohydrates, calories, and value alignment. Hydration is one of the sort of overlooked areas of food and mood, I think, because hydration is so important to our brain function. Our brain is over 70% made up of water. So if we are even slightly dehydrated, what we see is a reduction in our capacity to think. So what we see is impaired memory and an increased perception of task difficulty. So essentially what that's saying is when we are dehydrated and only even a very small amount dehydrated, so as little as 2% dehydrated, we find a task more challenging to do than if we were well hydrated. So it's a very small amount of dehydration that has a fairly significant impact on our ability to remember things and perceive a task as difficult or easy. Next, we have carbohydrates. So glucose, which every single type of carbohydrate breaks down to glucose eventually. That's what our body does. That's how we utilize carbohydrates. And glucose is the primary source of fuel for our brain. Our brain prefers to use glucose over any other energy source, essentially. So if we are not eating good quality carbohydrates, if we're not eating enough carbohydrates, our brain has to rely on other methods to source fuel and to function, essentially. So it's not the primary, it's not the preferable source to be using anything other than carbohydrates. So this is why carbohydrates are so important. Additionally, highly refined carbohydrates and sugars obviously interact differently in our body than whole grain or high fiber carbohydrates. So what we find with the highly refined carbohydrates is that they do sort of give you that energy boost, that short-term hit of sugar, but then they can lead to blood sugar crashes and not giving you that sustained long-term energy release. Third, we've got our calories. So hunger I've put in here because, I mean, it's something that I experience very frequently. And it's truly a thing. If we are not eating enough calories or if we're not eating adequately throughout the day, so in adequate intervals throughout the day, a good spread of calories over the day, what we find is that it influences our mood, our concentration, and our energy levels. Our brain uses 20% of the calories that we consume. So if we are like on a calorie restricted diet, what we are also doing is restricting the amount of calories that our brain is able to use quite significantly. And we're going to go through a really interesting study when we come to this section in a little bit. Finally, I've got here value alignment. Now, I'm not going to go too much detail into this, but it's a really important point, and one that I just mentioned before about Christmas time is how eating in line with our values changes our mental health and mental well-being and our mood in that short term. Because again, if we use Christmas as an example, if your values are to live a healthy and balanced life and you spend the entire month of December and first half of January eating chocolate and lollies and cakes and chips and cheese and crackers and alcohol for all day, every day, or, for half the day, every day, by the end of January, you're probably going to be feeling not so good because of the choices that you've made. Your mood is going to take an impact because you've made choices that are actually not in alignment with what you value, which is health and well-being. Now, obviously not everybody values that, but I think a large percentage of us do have some sort of value towards our health and well-being. So it's really important to acknowledge that when we are eating, we do have to acknowledge what is important to us and what we value as a person, which is going to be slightly different to the next person. As I've mentioned and in my bio, I am very pro-balance. So having those treats and those sorts of things as part of my everyday life is something that is really important to me and is something that I really value. So if I'm actually not having a little bit of chocolate here and there, I actually find that it makes me feel worse because it's not living a value aligned life. So again, I think it's really important to consider that side of it. It's a very different way to think about food and mood. Okay, so when it comes to carbohydrates, you've probably seen this before, you probably know it, but these are the things that we want to try and lean towards and the things that we want to try and limit. So we're choosing those high fiber carbohydrates, the ones that come with all of the other good stuff in them. So fruit, which comes with the antioxidants, the fiber, the nutrients, the starchy vegetables, so things like potato or sweet potato or corn, our whole grains, so grainy bread, brown rice, rolled oats, quinoa, buckwheat, all of those ancient grains that we also see, as well as legumes, lentils, and beans. These carbohydrates come along with a whole host of other nutrients in them, which not only provide us with other benefits, but they are high in fiber, which means that they are going to slowly release that glucose into our bloodstream and provide us with consistent energy levels throughout the day. On the flip side of the coin, we've got our sugar sweetened beverages, our sweets, and our refined carbohydrates and ultra processed foods or ultra processed carbohydrates. And these are the ones that we want to limit or avoid depending on, again, how sort of strict you want to go with that. I always say limit as opposed to avoid because I think we should think about more focus on what we can do rather than what we shouldn't do. And these are the things that we want to just limit in our life. Okay, so when it comes to hydration, this is a beautiful chart of what your urine color should or could or shouldn't look like. You might want to take a screenshot of this one and compare it next time you go to the bathroom. But essentially, a lot of people think that 2 liters of water is the recommended amount of water per day. And it is a great sort of starting point, but it's not the exact number for every single person when it comes to keeping hydrated. Some people will need more, some people will need less than that to stay optimally hydrated. It really depends on your body, how much you sweat, how much you're exercising, and also the environment that you live in. So if you're living in really hot and humid environments, you're going to need to drink more than if you were living in really cold and dry climates. So what we're aiming for when it comes to our urine color is one of those first 3 colors there. So it does not need to be completely clear. I think that's a myth that we should get out of the way. It is okay to have some yellow in the color, but we want it to be a very pale and odorless color when we are going to the bathroom. And that is a sign that you are well hydrated. If we are moving down into the 5, 6, 7, or 8, you are quite severely dehydrated and need to drink water as soon as possible and drink plenty of water. Now, when it comes to hydration, the best way to stay hydrated is to drink water regularly throughout the day as opposed to smashing, a liter in the morning and a liter at night time, because what we find then we actually retain that water a bit better than weeing it out really quickly and not actually being able to sort of keep those hydration levels at a steady and constant state throughout the day. The good news with the effects of dehydration is that they are obviously improved with rehydration. So if you are finding yourself quite tired, lacking in concentration, finding tasks more difficult than you think they should be, then it is really important that you do rehydrate and start drinking some more water, or think about how much water you may have had throughout the day. Now, any beverages do count as hydration. So even things like coffees and teas, yes, they have caffeine in them, and yes, they have a slight diuretic effect, but it doesn't negate the amount of fluid that you're actually getting with that. However, we do want to prioritize water and avoid sugar-sweetened beverages when we are talking about hydration. The primary source of hydration should be water or herbal teas. Okay, caffeine and alcohol is a really interesting one I love to throw in here, because it's something that we sort of are all familiar with, and most of us will have dabbled with one or the other on a regular or irregular basis. The good news for us coffee drinkers is that caffeine in low to moderate doses does actually improve our short-term concentration, performance, and memory, which I love to hear because I am a coffee drinker and I thoroughly enjoy my coffee. For those wondering, low to moderate doses is sort of 2 to 3 cups of coffee a day. So it's actually more than what some people think. The downside of routine caffeine use, so having coffee every single day, is that the more you have it, the less effective it is. So the more you essentially become accustomed to it, and you don't see those improved effects when it comes to concentration, performance, and memory. So the ideal way to utilize caffeine and coffee in particular is to have it when you desperately need it. Now, I say that as someone who is a routine coffee drinker. Do as I say, not as I do, because yeah, I'm a routine coffee drinker through and through. Next is alcohol. And again, a really important thing to sort of cover off at this time of year, because we are exposed to a lot more alcohol at this time of year, or are influenced to drink a lot more, I feel. Alcohol, I think most of us will know, will impair memory, alertness, and cognition, and even in low doses. So even as little as like 1 glass of wine, we can see those impacts on our alertness and memory in the short term. And then obviously, if we are drinking larger amounts, we see those in a bigger effect of those, but also the following day we are seeing effects on our memory and alertness and cognition, and even on our mood and mental well-being the next day. So you may have had the experience where you've had, I call it anxiety, where you get anxiety the day after you've had a sort of binge drinking session or a large drinking session, and part of that's due to a reduction in serotonin the next day. Lots of reasons why that also might happen, depending on how much you've drunk and things that you might have done or not done whilst you were drinking as well. Okay, so when it comes to calories and how calories influence our mood and mental well-being, there was a really, really interesting study that was done, I think, I'm going to go off the top of my head, I think it was in the 40s or 50s, so it was a long time ago now, but it was a really interesting study. And the reason why I still reference it now is because it's a study that can't be replicated because of what was done in it. So essentially what they did is they had a group of men and they starved them for, how many weeks was it? It was a number, 12 weeks, I think it was. And they wanted to see what the effects of this semi-starvation was over this period of time. And what they found was these men who had been starved experienced far more fatigue, far more irritability, far more depression, and far more apathy than if they weren't being starved. Now, you might say that's obvious, but what I want to point out here is that the diet they were on for semi-starvation was 1,600 calories a day. Now, for anyone who's sort of done calorie counting or anything in your life before, you know anything about calories, 1,600 is more than some online diets will put you on. A lot of online diets will stupidly put you on 1,200 calories a day if you just Google what they're going to tell you to do. So it's not that these men weren't eating anything. They were eating what some online diet places will tell you to do as a healthy diet. And they were seeing significant fatigue and irritability and symptoms of depression as well. So the amount of food we are eating and the amount of calories that we are consuming is having a significant impact on our mental well-being and our day-to-day concentration. Some common signs that you might not be getting in enough calories are things like that brain fogginess, where you just can't concentrate properly. You got that dizziness and you're feeling a little bit weak. And another really, really big one and a big red flag for me when it comes to not eating enough is constantly thinking about food. So if you are finishing a meal and already thinking about what you're going to eat next, when you're going to eat it, how much you're going to eat, that's a sign you're probably not actually eating enough in that meal that you're having now or in general. I can't talk about calories without talking about the long-term impact of overconsumption. I know we're talking right now about the short-term impacts, but I wanted to add this in. Overconsumption, so where we are eating more than we need and essentially leading to continual weight gain, we do have an increased risk of cognitive decline. So things like dementia and Alzheimer's, the more we consume and the more weight we continue to gain over years and years and years, we do see an increased risk of cognitive decline. So essentially what we want to do is we want to find that balance where we are eating enough, we are maintaining our healthy body weight, we're not gaining excessive amount of weight, and we're not restricting ourselves and starving ourselves as well. Okay, so the longer term impact of food on our mood. First way we're going to talk about is through our gut health. Now, many of you may have seen the statistic that 70% of, no, sorry, got 70 in my head, 90% of serotonin is made in our gut. Now, if you have seen this, and if you do continue to see it all over the internet, what I want you to do is to think about what is the next thing that you're reading from this company or this post or wherever it is you're seeing. Because is this actually true? Our gut does produce, yes, it does produce 90% of the serotonin, but the serotonin, which is the happy hormone that is produced in the gut, has no role whatsoever on our brain or our mental well-being. So it is not actually through the serotonin produced in the gut that we are seeing these impacts on our mood and mental well-being, but a lot of companies out there are utilizing this statistic to sell you some sort of gut health supplement or sell you some gut health diet. Now, again, that's not to say that the gut doesn't play a big role in our mental health and mental well-being, but again, it's a statistic that I want everyone to be aware of, that it's actually not necessarily true. It's true in its raw fact, but the influence on our mood and mental well-being is not actually something that is influenced by that serotonin. Our brain only produces a small amount of serotonin, but that is the serotonin that influences our mood and our mental well-being. Okay, so when it comes to gut health, this is where we do have a little bit of research that is coming out talking about how it is influencing our depressive symptoms. Now, the really big thing when we talk about how our diet is influencing our symptoms of depression and symptoms of mental illness. So if we already have a mental illness, say major depressive disorder, and we are changing our diet to a healthy diet, which we'll go through in a little bit, how is that going to impact our symptoms of depression? So what there is some research coming out saying is that people who have high gut microbiota diversity, so microbiota being all of the different bugs, bacteria, yeasts, fungi that we have in our gut, the more diversity you have in those gut bacteria, the less depressive symptoms you may experience. Now, the thing I like to point out with this is that the research is not in a very solid state with this. We don't actually know, is it that people who have symptoms of depression or bad symptoms of depression have lower gut microbiota diversity because they have the depression, or is it because of the diet? So there's sort of a chicken or egg thing here that there hasn't been worked out yet. However, the good news is, regardless of what impact it does have on our mood and mental well-being, we do know that the things that we do to improve our gut diversity, which has an impact over our entire body, are things that are healthy and are going to improve our well-being on a whole body perspective, not just a mental health perspective. And this is including carbohydrates, complex carbohydrates, and high fiber carbohydrates, and a high fiber diet. So one of the most practical things you can do to improve your gut health is to include at least 30 different plants in your diet per week. Now, that sounds like a lot when you think about it, 30 different plants, like how am I going to get in 30 different plants? But these plants include things like legumes, lentils, nuts, seeds, herbs, onion, garlic, vegetables, fruits, whole grains. So it actually isn't as hard as you might think when you read that 30. And what I encourage you to do after today's session is actually to, if you get 5 minutes today, sit down and write down all of the different plants that you may have had today already. And if you can remember the rest of the week, then that's even better. And see if you can aim to get 30 different plants per week. Now, a really good way to do things like this is to increase the amount of plants that you are consuming in your diet is to include a variety of plants in each meal. So for example, I love things like the kale slaw mix from Coles and Woolworths because there's about 4 or 5 different vegetables just in that. And then if you add the little seed mix that they've got, you've probably already got nearly 10 different plants in that one salad mix. So those sort of things are really good, quick, easy wins when it comes to improving your gut health. Now, fermented foods and probiotics are not as hyped up as they sort of are online. Fermented foods, the really challenging thing with fermented foods is that we can't really study the impact that these fermented foods have on our gut health because we don't know if they survive the acidic conditions of the stomach. So what I say with fermented foods like kimchi, kefir, yogurt, those sorts of things is they are all incredibly healthy foods and we should all include them in our diet. We just don't know how much benefit they are having on our gut health. But regardless, we know that they are beneficial and healthy foods, so include them. Probiotics are very strain specific. So what that means is that if we are taking probiotics, it probably shouldn't be just everybody taking one for general health and well-being. What we want to do is think about what is the purpose that we are taking this probiotic. And some of the evidence-based things that we have for probiotics are for antibiotic-associated diarrhea and for traveler's diarrhea. We do have some really specific strains that are beneficial in those conditions, as well as in irritable bowel syndrome. There is a couple of different strains that have shown to have some benefits in there. Okay, so the Mediterranean diet is probably the most studied diet when it comes to actually nutrition in general, but in particular mental well-being. It has been studied for decades and has numerous health benefits. Arguably probably the healthiest diet in the world, but what I like to point out is that it is also the most studied diet in the world, and there are other diets around the world that probably do live up to similar expectations but just haven't been studied as rigorously. So like the Nordic diet, for example, which is again just the whole food diet based on the Nordic style of eating, whereas the Mediterranean diet is based on the Mediterranean style of eating. What they have found is that eating in accordance with the Mediterranean diet is associated with a reduction in these depressive symptoms. Excuse me. But like I said before, it's really hard to sort of tease out what is causing this reduction in depressive symptoms. The other thing I always like to point out with this improvement in depressive symptoms is that when we make any sort of behavior change, it actually improves our mood and can improve depressive symptoms. So it's really hard to know, was it the diet that improved depressive symptoms, or was it because that person increased their self-efficacy by making a healthier change to their lifestyle, and that gave them that boost of confidence, that energy, that self-efficacy, essentially, that they are doing something positive for themselves, and that can in itself improve depressive symptoms. So that's something that's really hard in the research to work out, okay, well, what was it? But again, it's a benefit that does improve depressive symptoms. So eating healthier and doing things for yourself, like cooking a meal and those sorts of things, do actually have improvements on depressive symptoms on their own, regardless of what the actual diet is. We do very much see, though, with the Mediterranean diet, a decreased risk of developing depression. So this is something that we do have very strong research for. There are also numerous other benefits of the Mediterranean diet around gut health and cardiovascular, stroke, cancer. Most conditions that I can think of, Mediterranean diet is reduces the risk of developing or improves symptoms of. Okay, so what is the Mediterranean diet? This is pulled from a 2020 paper, and essentially it is a food pyramid that is based on the Mediterranean diet, which also includes a lot of the Mediterranean lifestyle factors as well. So we've got in there at the bottom there the communal eating, the cooking of food, the fresh produce, the relaxing and the physical activity. Sorry. And we've also got water and tea, as you can see down the bottom there. Now, when we compare this to the old Australian food pyramid, we don't use the pyramid anymore, but if I'm sure we've all seen the pyramid at some point in our lifetime, it is similar, that bottom layer, to our food pyramid, where we have got the whole grains and we've got the fruit and the vegetables. The key thing that we see is the difference between the Mediterranean diet on that bottom level of the food pyramid and our food pyramid is that extra virgin olive oil is actually there in that bottom level. It's something that they have essentially at every single meal every day, and it's something that they consider an integral part of their diet, and is probably one of the key foods that we think is having a big impact in the Mediterranean diet with all of these health benefits that we do see. Next there, we've got all of our aromatics, so garlic and onion, as well as olives, legumes, and nuts and seeds. Then as we move up, we get into the more animal-based products. So again, what you will notice with the Mediterranean diet is that most of the food pyramid, so the large portion of it, is all plant-based foods. And at the very top there, we have our red and processed meats and our sweets and our more ultra-processed foods as well. Okay, so how does the Mediterranean diet have all of these amazing benefits? On the left here, we've got essentially the food components of the Mediterranean diet. So we've got fruits, vegetables, whole grains and legumes, nuts and seeds, extra virgin olive oil, the dairy, and in particular the fermented dairies, the yogurts and cheese, fish and seafood, and eggs. So I guess the big thing that's missing from there is the red meat, which is something that Australians do tend to eat a lot more of than a typical Mediterranean diet. The nutrients that we derive from those are there in the middle. So prebiotics, fiber, healthy fats, vitamins and minerals, and the probiotics, or the sort of fermented foods that they have, as I said, with the dairy and the yogurt. Now, the mechanisms that we see these benefits on our brain in particular, so this is actually focused on our brain, but these mechanisms will have whole body effects as well, is through various different mechanisms, which we have varying degrees of evidence to sort of show how strong these associations are. But one of the big ones we do find is reduced inflammation and reduced oxidative stress. So that reduction in aging, essentially, that we see, or that slowing of aging that we see of the brain, and also that improved brain development and brain function. They are sort of big things that we are pulling out from the research, that the Mediterranean diet is having an impact on our brain. And the other thing that we see is the impact on our cortisol levels and our HPA axis, so our hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is where our stress hormones, our cortisol and everything are coming from. So having a Mediterranean style diet and the nutrients that we get from that are having an impact in all of these different ways. Okay, so what is the difference between the Mediterranean diet and our standard Australian diet? Sort of touched on this mostly, but essentially they have a lot more healthy fats, and in particular, I'm not even going to say olive oil here, extra virgin olive oil is the key. We want that extra virgin olive oil, not just the standard olive oil or the light olive oil. The extra virgin is where we are getting the antioxidants and the polyphenols, which are having these benefits in both our brain, our heart, and our gut. They do have a lot more plant-based meals. Now, that doesn't mean that they need to be entirely vegetarian or vegan, but essentially most of their meal is made up of different types of plants, and the animal products are a very small component of their meals, as opposed to in Australia, where we find, like, you know, our meals are steak and veg, and the steak or the meat is making up that large component of our meal. They do have a lot more seafood and oily fish than we do. Vegetables and legumes. Fermented dairy is where they get most of their dairy products from, as opposed to Australians, where we'd get a lot of dairy from milk and flavoured milk and ice cream and custards and creams and butter and those sorts of things. Theirs is mostly fermented. They use a lot of herbs and spices and whole grains as well, whereas the standard Australian diet does contain a lot more red meat, processed foods, added sugars and refined grains. And if we added the standard American diet in here, we'd go a whole nother level beyond the Australian diet. Okay, so these are just some really simple swaps that you can do to sort of translate what we've gone through into practical everyday tips. So just little swaps that you can do to move towards a healthier diet, a more Mediterranean style diet, as well as a more good mood friendly diet. So things like swapping crisps for popcorn, which is a whole grain. Obviously not getting the buttery, movie popcorn or flavored, those sorts of ones, but just standard popcorn with a bit of sea salt is a great snack option. Swapping out processed and refined cereals for things like whole grains, like rolled oats. And the same goes with our bread. You don't have to cut out bread and carbohydrates altogether, but we are looking to move away from that ultra processed white bread to something that is grainy and seedy, and we're actually seeing all of those different grains in the bread. The good news, if you are looking at those 30 different plants per week, is each and every grain that is in your bread, that counts as a plant for the week. So if you're getting a whole grain that's got soy, linseeds, wheat, rye, barley, all of those sorts of things, you've got 5 different grains right there in one slice of toast, which is great news and does provide those gut health benefits. Swapping out processed meats, and in particular these deli meats, we know that they are not good for us. We know that they do increase our risk of not only colorectal cancer, but again, just our mood. For healthier meat alternatives, so things like healthy fats through our salmon, sardines, tuna, which canned is actually perfectly fine to be doing. You are still getting those healthy fats in those canned fish products. Swapping out ultra processed crackers and those sorts of things for something more whole. So swapping like a cheese cracker for a slice of cheese with some fruit, and swapping our candy for things like fruit and more whole foods again. Okay, so take home tips from this, which hopefully, something has jumped out as you as something you can do today, tomorrow, this week, or before the end of the year. Focusing on eating more whole foods, so less processed foods. And when I talk about processed foods, I do really want you to focus on less processed, not necessarily not processed at all, because that is really hard to do. So processing sort of comes in different degrees, where we remove the product from the original product. So for example, if we think about like those cheese crackers I had on that previous slide there, the cheddar and parmesan crackers, that would be an ultra processed food. Cheese is actually still a processed food because it's not milk. Milk is the original product. So milk that comes from the cow is the original product, and it's processed into cheese. And then the cheese is processed into a powder, and that powder is then put into the crackers. So what we get with the crackers is so far removed from the original product, which is the milk product, whereas the cheese is very minimally processed. It still resembles pretty much the original product. It's just gone through some fermentation and different processes to get it into a slightly different product, but it still resembles that original product. So when we talk about whole foods, it's moving towards foods that may still be processed, but they're not ultra processed. Eating enough and regularly, so making sure we're getting in enough calories and we're having a good balance of calories throughout the day, so we're not starving ourselves all day and then having just a huge meal in the evening. Looking after your gut health with fiber, and also I'm going to add in there lots of different plants. Drinking plenty of water and potentially having a little coffee if that is something that you do want to do. Swapping more plant-based meals, swapping more meat-based meals for plant-based meals or fish or seafood. Eating the rainbow, so getting those different colors and that diversity in your plants in, and ditching the restrictive diets, because as I said before, we do want to have that balance and we do want to make sure that we are eating in alignment with our values. And I don't think anyone values following a diet to such extreme that they can't live a life. So, where you're having to prep your meal before you go to a family function, that's not living a life. We do want that social aspect of food and eating, and I think it's really important to include. Okay, question time.
Amazing, Marika. That was such a great session. I love hearing Marika speak. You come away just thinking, yeah, there's heaps that I can do just to make small differences. There's lots of questions in the chat, so I might just start out with at the top of the chat. So the first one's about irritable bowel syndrome. You did touch on this. What advice do you have for people who suffer with severe irritable bowel syndrome and chronic fatigue syndrome due to severe food intolerances? Plays a massive role in daily life. It exacerbates fatigue and IBS and pain levels. Food becomes a necessary process rather than enjoyment. An episode of IBS or CFS lasts for weeks. Any books would be great. So I guess just overall comments on that, or any resources you could point that person to?
Yes. So IBS is a really interesting one. I actually used to work a lot in IBS and I could talk for days about it. there is a huge component of a hyperactive nervous system essentially to the gut. So it is very stress and emotionally driven. And that's not to say that the symptoms that you're experiencing are not real. Like you get real pain, real diarrhea, real constipation, these sorts of things. But when we are stressed, when our nervous system is in overdrive, we see a huge increase in these. And so one of the things that there's a lot of new research coming out around with IBS is things like hypnotherapy. So there's actually a website called, I think it's Nerva, Nerva, I think. And they've got some really interesting research on the benefits of hypnotherapy in severe IBS. Because one of the things with IBS is that you can just restrict your diet, but it actually is not improving. And then you lose that quality of life from your diet as well, which then sort of exacerbates the mental side of things. So you can get in this really negative cycle around IBS, and it's really challenging to get out of. But I would definitely suggest looking into some of those more alternative therapies. So being hypnosis is one of them. It's evidence-based. There is a lot of evidence, as I said, coming out about it. But things like stress management is really important. Meditation, yoga is having some really good research coming out around how that can influence your IBS as well. Sorry, I could talk about that for a long time.
No, I think that's great. And it is such an interesting approach to so many chronic health conditions that we have now, really having that holistic approach and managing stress. And yeah, that's brilliant. Okay, so there's a question here, and there's another one later on in the chat as well, so I might combine the two. It's around fruit. So is it wise to distribute the intake of fruit throughout the day, or just eat as much as you can until you've had a regular intake of food? There was another question later on as well. I've lost it in the chat. There's so many questions. Oh yeah, here it is. I love my fruit, but also know that we have to be careful not to have too much of a good thing, as there is a significant amount of sugar in it. Moderation is the key, yes. So if you could just touch on those two questions around fruit, please.
Yeah, so fruit, I really don't get people to restrict fruit intake unless fruit is displacing other foods in the diet. So what I mean by that is if you are only eating fruit and you're not getting enough calcium, enough protein, enough fiber from other sources, or nutrients in general, then yes, you're probably eating too much fruit. If you are eating, let's say, 5 serves of fruit per day, but you are also getting in, balanced meals where you're getting in your healthy fats, you're getting in your calcium from your potentially dairy sources or dairy alternatives, you're getting in, healthy fats from things like avocado. I mean, avocado is actually a fruit, but you are getting in a variety of nutrients and you are getting a varied diet, and you just have a lot of fruit on top of that. Great, that is perfectly fine. And if anything, I would encourage that, because it is a great way to add, like if you need to add more calories to your diet, it is a great way to do so. So people who are highly active, have as much fruit as you want.
Fantastic. Now this one's quite a specific one, so I'm not sure. Let me know if you don't feel comfortable answering it. But we have someone who's saying they're on hormone therapy for cancer, which messes with metabolism. She's been advised to have a low-carb diet, but she's having trouble eating enough fiber. What are some of the low-carb foods that are high in fiber? And I guess this is a good one in that, with that lens of women's health as well, around menopause, because it's the same sort of issue here. There was a slide just after this person asked the question that you had around your complex carbohydrates, which was fantastic. But yeah, any additional information you have for her would be amazing.
So when we talk about a low carbohydrate diet, usually what this means is low carbohydrate, not no carbohydrate. And so a lot of people think that when you have to go on a low carbohydrate diet, that means that you can't have any carbohydrates. Whereas the reality is a sort of standard moderate carbohydrate diet, we are having about 50% of our calories coming from carbohydrates, whereas a low carbohydrate diet, we're having sort of anywhere under 30%. So that does mean you can still have carbohydrates in your diet, and that's, to that extent, it obviously depends on how much you're eating, but you can still have things like whole grains or legumes and lentils and those sorts of things in your diet. We're just not having excessive portions of them. We're not having them at every single meal. So first and foremost, I would encourage you to include some of those carbohydrates that I mentioned on that slide. Obviously just not in huge portions if you are, for medical reasons, on a lower carbohydrate diet. The other thing is we do have a lot of vegetables that are low carbohydrate but do have dietary fiber in them. So things like zucchinis and those more water-based vegetables like broccoli, even fruits like berries, high fiber, but lower in carbohydrate.
Fantastic. Thank you. And we have another question here. I have intolerance to mannitol and sorbitol and GOS. There are so many foods that have these sugars. I use FODMAP app, but very limited foods due to the above. Any ideas for food recipes? We could maybe point this person to your website.
My website's actually not up at the moment.
Oh, isn't it?
So for low FODMAP recipes, which is essentially what it sounds like, there is a few blogs that do really good low FODMAP recipes. I'm trying to think of the name of them, but if you just Google FODMAP recipe blogs, I can't remember the name of, but there's a few really good ones out there that will be top hits on Google, so you'll be able to find them. The other thing is, which I'm sure you're aware of, is the Monash FODMAP app. Their website has, and probably their app as well, has quite a few recipes on there, so that's a good resource for that. The other thing with FODMAPs, again, I could talk about IBS for a long time, is that we do want to be trying to have very small amounts of these. It's not that you can't ever have these foods. We just want to be working within your symptom load. So it should be, there should be a level of which you can tolerate, hence the word intolerance. There's a level of tolerable level, and then there's a level of intolerance. So sometimes very small amounts you can tolerate, and that might be just like one small bit of something that has a small amount of mannitol in it once a week, and that will actually help to improve that tolerance to it as well.
Great. And the next question, I think you've answered this actually. My feeling is balanced food and seasonal fruits and vegetables are the best way to go. What's your opinion? But I think we've heard from you today that that's a great way to go. There's another question here. I'm also celiac and get the impression many gluten-free alternatives are highly processed foods. Are there any products or types of products you would either recommend or avoid?
A lot of highly processed foods when it comes to gluten-free, because they're trying to essentially mimic gluten-containing products. I focus, this is just more me personally, with my gluten-free diet, try and focus more on whole foods that are gluten-free, because even from a budget perspective, it is so much more budget friendly than buying these specific gluten-free foods. They can be really quite expensive. So that's things like rice, buckwheat, quinoa, a lot of rice products I do consume. The one sort of, I guess, processed gluten-free food that I do tend to have is a gluten-free bread, which again, they are fairly highly processed if you are buying them from the supermarket, but going for something that is as minimally processed as possible. So you've got those whole grains in there. They are obviously still more processed than like a whole grain bread that you might get from a bakery that's not gluten-free, but choosing more of those foods that are naturally gluten-free as opposed to being processed to be made gluten-free.
Lovely. This question is around, you made comments around the Mediterranean diet. What comments can you make regarding the findings that societal factors in European diet communities is more significant than the makeup of the food?
So this is again something I did touch on a little bit, the influence of the way that we eat, the way that we think around food and everything has, as opposed to those societal influences. So the community and the sitting around the table and the slow enjoying of the food. And those things in the research is really hard to tease out, and why I did sort of explicitly say that it's really hard to know whether it is the diet and whether it's those specific nutrients, or whether it is all of these other things, and which is why it's so important to sort of embrace that entire lifestyle as much as we can. And also why I like to point out that taking a supplement that has the nutrients in it that might be found in a Mediterranean diet is not going to actually have that much health benefit. It might provide you with a little bit of benefit if you're actually not eating any nutrients and not having a very nutrient-dense diet. But if you were to extract the nutrients from a Mediterranean diet and put them all into a supplement and take that, I don't think you'd see anywhere near the influence of health benefits as we do see. The one thing we do know, though, is that a lot of these studies are not actually done in like European, so for example, the Blue Zones diet, if you've heard of them, they're looking at specific areas and how the people who live in those areas actually eat and live and whatnot. Whereas a lot of the research from the Mediterranean diet is actually done in more clinical settings. So we've got, everyday research participants going in and following the diet that they've been told to follow. So they're not necessarily living that like European lifestyle where they are, cooking with their nonna for 6 hours in the afternoon or those sorts of things.
Right. There's so many questions. I'm not going to get through them, but very quickly, you mentioned coffee and green tea. What about black tea?
Yes, so herbal teas. So the reason I mentioned herbal teas and actually not green tea. So green tea does have lots of antioxidants and is great, but does have some caffeine in it, which again we do know has that cognitive benefit. But from I guess it depends where with the hydration perspective, we want to focus on herbal teas or water. Caffeine, black tea, yes, absolutely, green tea or coffee. They all provide antioxidants and also provide fluid as well. So they are going to have an impact on your cognition and whatnot. Black tea and green tea have less caffeine than coffee, which may be a benefit or may be a detriment depending on what you're going for.
Fabulous. Might just do one last question and then we will be able to perhaps send some of the answers to the questions around with the information that CSC send out after the session today. So someone said, what sort of nuts and what is the allowance? I think what they mean is how many nuts are you allowed?
Yeah. So again, one of the really interesting things with the studies around particularly mental health and the Mediterranean diet is that these diets had really high amounts of healthy fats in them. So lots of nuts and lots of extra virgin olive oil in them. I think it was about 50 grams of nuts that they were having a day in them, which is a decent handful every single day. The type of nut is not so important. What I would say is try and have a variety of types of nuts because different nuts all have different nutrients in them. So for example, walnuts are a great source of plant-based omega-3s. Peanuts have a lot more protein in them. Cashews have a lot more iron in them and selenium in them. And then we've got a lot of the Brazil nuts are great with selenium. Sorry, they're the selenium ones. So there's a lot of different nutrients we get from a lot of different nuts. So my best pick is to go for like a nut mix where you're getting that variety.
Lovely. Well, thank you so much, Marika. That was an amazing session. I think it's really encouraging for us to think about the way we eat is actually going to have an effect on our energy, our mental health and our cognition. Don't know about anyone else on the call, but as we limp towards the finish line of the year and we're all pretty tired, I think that can be only good for us to get through the work year and to really enjoy that festive break over the Christmas period. It's nice just to have some small takeouts, like drinking water. Who knew that drinking water could make such a significant impact on our health and well-being? And it's such an easy thing to do. And, at Christmas time, it's a good time to perhaps think about whether or not we want to drink. And if we do drink, to perhaps drink a lot less than Australians tend to, because you've clearly pointed out the impact that alcohol can have on our mood as well. So I hope that this session today is empowering you all to have the balance that you want throughout December and January. A huge thank you to CSC for hosting this important session at this time of year. We will answer the questions, or Marika will, to the questions that weren't covered today, and we'll send the responses out. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your day. I hope you really enjoyed it. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.